Welcome to the New Books Network.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode of the Princeton University Press Ideas Podcast, a joint production of Princeton University Press and the New Books Network. I'm Mark Klobus, and today I'm speaking with Julia Sonnevend, author of the book Charm: How Magnetic Personalities Shape Global Politics. Julia, welcome to the New Books Network.
Thanks so much for having me.
Well, thanks for agreeing to be on our show. I was wondering if you could start us off by telling our listeners something about yourself.
Well, let's start with my accent because the listeners will hear it. So I grew up in Hungary, in Budapest, and moved to the US when I was 26 to study at Yale and at Columbia and became an academic. I'm currently an associate professor of sociology at the New School for Social Research, which is in New York. And I love doing podcasts, so speaking to a broader audience than the narrow confines of academia.
So what led you to write a book about charm in politics?
Well, the answer might surprise you. So I was sitting in a faculty meeting, and you wouldn't think that's a typical site for charm. It isn't. In a different workplace, they were discussing hiring a new person, and they were saying we have to be very, very careful because some candidates are charming and they can just, seduce us, and then they are not productive and they don't do anything and don't contribute to faculty life and departmental life. And I was sitting there and I thought, this is so interesting. Like, that's what we are afraid of, with all our training and everything, that there might be somebody who has personal magnetism entering, the fortress of academia. And I started to think about this question, both the attraction of charm and the suspicion that surrounds charm. And first I was thinking, obviously, my workplace, and then broader. Initially, I imagined writing about every aspect of social life and its relation to charm. And then the focus over time became more and more politics, and I thought, that's really a key and central site where charm can be performed, and charm really influences our life in deep ways. But I emphasize it throughout the book that charm is there in, grocery stores, at daycare drop-offs, everywhere where we are, we can meet charming people.
It feels that what you've highlighted is how consequential charm can be, not just in terms of interpersonal relationships, but how it brings about, certain figures and becomes a tool for affecting agendas. So what you do in your book is you deconstruct how charm works. I thought it was really interesting because I had never really thought about it until I had read your book. But you identify these 5 building blocks. I was wondering if you could perhaps explain what these building blocks are and how they fit within the context of politics in a variety of different contexts.
So I would start with the claim that the book argues, I argue in this book, that charm is a key feature of politics. We have seductive, magnetic personalities who rise to power, and some of them for very beneficial, important political goals, and in other cases, there is a dark side. So I became really interested in how do politicians build up their personal magnetism, their charm, and since most of the times we don't meet politicians in person, we speak here about mediated charm. So how they perform their personal magnetism in mediated environments, social media, traditional media, press, and so on. And, I'm a social scientist, and we social scientists love measuring things, defining things, using jargon, all that. And charm resists that. You can't narrowly define it. It works in different ways, in different contexts. So it was a really tough task for a social scientist like me to pin down charm. I still say that you cannot put a straitjacket on charm. There isn't a, definition that fits all cases. But what I have done, I researched this question internationally in a wide variety of cases and tried to look for similarities. How do politicians build up their personal magnetism, particularly in social media? That seems to be one of the key sites of politics these days. And then I was able to pin down a few key features, and I'm not going to mention all of them, due to time reasons, and I want the reader to actually read the book. But to mention a few ones. So one is, for instance, restaging. So there are traditional sites where we perform politics, pressers, meeting rooms, Congress, and so on. But increasingly, politicians create new stages that they show to the viewers. For instance, they bring you to the backstage, they show you their team, the place where they work, where they write drafts, and so on. They might have a live video from the back seat of their car. These are not traditional sides of politics. So that's something I have seen. Another example is demasking. So politicians have a formal role, even though they are regular human beings like us, they perform a particular political role. And what demasking is the moment when they drop that formal role. So one example is that President Biden, after the invasion of Ukraine by Russia, visited Warsaw, Poland, which was packed with Ukrainian refugees at that time. He met refugees, he very much felt for them, he really empathized with what they went through, and then he had to give a speech. And in this speech, he suddenly, which was not a scripted moment, said, this man, namely the Russian president, cannot stay in power. And this movement just rocked social media. It was not an expected moment. Even the speechwriters were really shocked that it's happening. But what happened in that moment, that he dropped the mask of the president of the United States, this formal role, that president has to tread carefully in diplomatic matters. And he was for a moment a regular human being expressing an emotion. And then he went back to his former role. So what did the White House have to do? They released a statement, he actually didn't mean regime change, it was just a moment, and so on. So then came damage control. But there are these moments in social media, particularly when politicians show for a moment a different side, and often that has to be corrected. But throughout, what they are doing is performing authenticity, which is a really weird thing to do in the media. As we all know, everything is manufactured in media environments. Yet what we expect from our politicians is performing, or in other words, faking authenticity.
One of the things that stood out for me as I was reading your book was the fact that what you describe in terms of these building blocks, you're not saying that a charming politician has all of them. And I think this is something that you've already implied with your description, which is that certain politicians tend to favor certain elements over others. Like some may be, may use demasking, while others are, because they're focused more upon restaging, which was another one of the elements, working in a controlled environment. They tend to prefer presenting something in a particular environment rather than necessarily having a mask that they drop. And you demonstrate this with these 5 case studies that you provide in the book. And the case studies are of politicians which are probably familiar to most listeners. Jacinda, Ardern, Viktor Orban, Javad Zarif, Kim Jong-un, and Angela Merkel. But what you do is you basically have them in 3 categories. So I was wondering if we could approach them from the category perspective. The first one being just these 2 politicians, Ardern and Orban, who you present as very as very charming individuals whose political career has been driven by or enabled by the charm that they've been able to present.
Yes. So I was thinking deeply, for a long time, how to write this book. And it would have been an easy way to just focus on, let's say, liberal politicians or kind of the predictable cases, writing about charm and President Obama. But what I wanted to do is to take radically different cases and show that, you can be liberal or you can be illiberal. You will use these tools currently if you are active and successful in international politics. So I directly chose Jacinda Ardern and Viktor Orban because they are radically different politically. The listeners will probably remember that Ardern was presented as the anti-Trump, basically a liberal faraway icon. She was on front pages of fashion magazines, and she provided particularly American readers and listeners with this imagination that there is a faraway politics that is better, that is in some ways perfect, embodied by kindness and attention and so on. In contrast to that, Orban delivered a very different message, But even in his case, I thought that the American representation was often two-dimensional and not showing the complexity of the personality and the personal magnetism that he builds up in mediated environment. And I directly say build up. What we are talking about is not how they are in regular, everyday life with their spouses, but what is the image that they build up for us in the media. And what I have seen in both cases, that obviously different, gender, different circumstances, but that they both use these tools to connect with audiences. They break the routine of politics, they restage, they demask. To give you an example, so Prime Minister Orban from Hungary is often presented as a sort of mini Mussolini, radical right-wing character in American representations. But if you look at his Facebook representation, it's a more complex picture. For instance, he regularly shows his grandchildren. In one of the pictures, he's diapering a grandchild. There is still his political message there. For instance, he says, in connection with the diapering picture, the caption was, "I'm going to give you back to your mother." So basically, it's the mother's role to do it. So there is a political message there that fits in many ways with the family structure he communicates. But at the same time, it does show a more personable, relatable character than many other kind of two-dimensional representations of Orban would allow. So what we are seeing here is that you can have radically different political views, but you still have to perform what I call charm in this book, by which I mean that politicians have to appear as one of us. It's really an absurd situation, because if you consider they have very different lives, they have very strict schedules, right? Like none of the high-level politicians live a life like I live as a professor, or, and any of the voters, yet, they have to put on their red baseball hat, they have to go to waffle houses, they have to diaper kids or grandkids, try to appear in every possible way, even though they have a packed schedule and they barely have time to visit the bathroom on the campaign trail. They will appear as this kind of authentic, regular person. And if they do not, then we will deem the performance cringe or something we simply can't fuse with, can't connect with. So that's what I was trying to show with these two first cases, that these politicians use charm strategically, and they can use it for liberal or illiberal purposes as well.
It's interesting to go back to the inspiration for the book, that when we talk about charm, we do think about it in terms of that personal face-to-face interaction. We think about it as something that's very organic and maybe even a little bit biological. And yet what you're describing is while politicians do that so much of this presentation, and again, you've already mentioned this, is through this, this curated, this medium, and about how what you're describing are these cases of how they present themselves in a way that is meant to be charming. It's not just, this is what my policy will be, or today I went and toured toured a dam or something like that. They're making an effort to be charming in ways, and what you do is you examine how those ways are presenting this, for lack of a better phrase, charm offensive.
Yes. So I contrast charm with another term that other listeners have often heard, which is charisma. I believe that charisma, traditionally understood, was about exceptional rhetorical performances. Let's think about Churchill or de Gaulle, these kind of characters giving bombastic speeches and almost like a godlike figure, and you are at a distance from them. That's very different from the type of charm that I'm describing here about contemporary politics, where politicians have to appear as one of us. As we would say, you would want to have a beer with them. That's a very different understanding of personal magnetism. And while they are still far away and they're still radically different, that sometimes they are kind of godlike, particularly if the voter worships that particular leader. At the same time, they have to have this personal, relatable characteristic, and they have to appear as authentic. And that's really absurd if you consider what makes a successful politician. A successful politician has to run boring meetings, there needs to be a team. He or she has to be able to delegate tasks, has to have endurance and so on. So there are many different qualities you need to have to be a successful politician, particularly if you lead a country. Yet what we expect here is this kind of regular everyday character who is completely authentic. And then if he makes a mistake, we are ready to drop the person. And if another candidate happens to have a good moment, we will be elevating that candidate in a second. And that creates a really volatile, unpredictable, and unstable environment, which has the potential of an amazing outcome of bringing change and enthusiasm and change we can believe in. But it can also bring an absolute political disaster because of the potential to deceive with this tool. So it's a really interesting environment in which we want that politicians to be our next door neighbor. And it's by definition they cannot be. And I also love when people, as a media researcher, tell me frequently, which is true, that the media is manufactured, fake. It's a performance, it's a theater, and so on. But at the same time, we also want our political candidates to be good actors, good performance, be part of that theater. So there is kind of duality is there in all of us. And it's not reconciled, this type of paradox. And particularly characterizes contemporary politics because of the media environment in which politicians operate. Charm and charisma has always been there in politics, but just consider that we are in an environment where you have the images, the videos, the text immediately there, and you also have the illusion, at least, to respond back.
And that gets us to the second category, which I thought was interesting because you described that expectation, and yet you also describe politicians in the second category who are not really ones who necessarily rise to power through charm, and yet they're in a position where they have to resort to it. They find it is a very useful tool to use. And so you categorize them as basically people who are undertaking charm offensives. And here you refer to the Iranian foreign minister, Javad Zarif, and then, of course, Kim Jong-un, who is...
It's not an obvious case, I know.
Exactly. He didn't really have to charm anybody. His position of power fell in his lap. And yet you're talking about two people who nonetheless demonstrate how charm is used, not just to win power, but to exercise it.
Yes, so there are cases when charm can become a weapon. And that's a situation in which a politician decides to use it for a brief period of time to change public perception. That could be local, domestic public perception, but more often it's international. And this is a tool that can be used by anyone, but it's very often used by authoritarian leaders. So there is a negative country image and you want to shift it in a second. In contrast to like a long-term marriage, I often describe it as an affair, like it's a quick thing. And it doesn't necessarily have lasting effects, but it changes life for, a moment. And the Iranian case is really interesting because that's about the 2015 nuclear deal negotiations between the United States and Iran. And, a nuclear deal negotiation we would think is not the side of charm. Okay, it's boring, it's tedious, it's technical details, and so on. But in 2015, Iran had a rather negative image in the United States, and that was a problem for the purposes of signing this deal. And then comes Iranian Foreign Minister Zarif, who uses charm in a very effective way. He was trained in the United States, so he speaks excellent English. He is, personable, relatable. He jokes. He takes walks with then Secretary of State Kerry. There are images of them engaging in these long conversations. They are smiling at each other. They joke. They appear as regular human beings interacting. And some of the images are even about, I would say almost friendship that is between Kerry and Zarif. And the international media love these images. It's hard to cover a nuclear deal negotiation because it's boring. It's not really meant for mass media. But once you have two characters who have these endearing moments, it's much easier to put that story into the shrinking space of foreign affairs reporting, which is very much the case at the moment in Western media. So it helped reshape Iran's image briefly. It helped in the process of signing the deal. And that's a larger question whether it had a longer effect. As we knew later on, President Trump withdrew the United States from the nuclear deal. So that is debatable, how long the effect is. But it was there. And, more briefly, I can say a word about Kim Jong-un, who is, again, not a likely candidate. But during the Winter Olympics in 2018, he did need that for improving the image of North Korea. And some of the listeners might remember that he enlisted female family members to join him to events. There were cheerleaders. There were moments when he took walks with the South Korean leader. There were live-covered events when he showed his kind of personal characteristics. So it was a very different Kim Jong-un. He even took a selfie, which was like unbelievable for the reporters who were covering him. But all this was a strategic effort to shift North Korea's image momentarily. Again, whether long-term impacts are there, that's a huge question. But this is a tool that we see. I also want to say very briefly that charm offensive is a term that particularly American journalists love to use about international leaders. Okay.
Now, you have these building blocks that you describe, and you talk about how people use them in ways to have charm. And yet your final case is I think, in many ways, the most fascinating, because you're describing how a politician who is, on the surface utterly lacking in charm, or is not or at least the very least charm is not the first word that comes to mind when you think of this person, who nonetheless, uses these tools as well. And I'm speaking of Angela Merkel. Who, very effective politician, a very prominent leader, and yet not necessarily in the same category as a Jacinda Ardern or a Viktor Orban in terms of the ability to, or even it seems sometimes the interest in using charm.
Yes, so she's a fascinating case in that way. It's 16 years of being Germany's chancellor, incredibly powerful political position. When she ended her term, she had more than 80% popularity rate, which is unbelievable in contemporary politics. So, while obviously there is criticism of her in many different ways, she is widely acknowledged as one of the successful politicians of our time. Yet, she hasn't used any of the tools I have described in this book. And I really wanted her to be there as a counter case. Partly, I often get this question from journalists of, are we going to see only charm in international politics? And I don't think that's the case. There will be some cases of Angela Merkel who simply don't do this. So what did Angela Merkel do? I looked at her Instagram because I thought that Instagram is a site where you must use some form of personal magnetism. And what I have found that at the beginning, her team played around a little bit with stylistic scenes and a bit of an Instagram culture very briefly. And then quickly, they shifted gears and approach, and they started to represent Merkel as she is in other forms of media. So instead of changing Merkel and making her into kind of an Instagram character or influencer, basically, she Merkelized Instagram. I mean, Instagram became more like Merkel in this case. And, if you look at the images, what is changing is basically the color of her jacket in the images. But other than that, it's a very persistent, very reliable image, and basically a politician there telling facts, complex stories, analysis to viewers and readers. It's very difficult to understand if you think of social media as only the site of spectacle and drama. The period of analysis I had included the pandemic, and it was striking what she did there. She really, in videos, explained scientific facts to viewers and listeners, to her followers in very complex ways, and in ways I would think it would be hard to do in US politics. But she did that in this kind of very reliable, predictable way. It was, as I call, the power of predictability. But it's in Germany. So it did raise a larger question about the historical past of the country. So we're dealing here with a country that had an extremely negative experience with charisma through Adolf Hitler, who weaponized his personal magnetism, his charisma to commit genocide. That's the German tradition. So if you grow up there, and I spent quite some time in Germany, including studying there for a while, you do get trained strongly in terms of suspicion towards charisma. And so I'm wondering, when I'm looking at that case, whether there was a historical influence there going on, that you are dealing with a voting public that is very skeptical, generally speaking, of charismatic performances. Nonetheless, Angela Merkel proved that you can ignore all the tools that I'm describing in this book, like consistently, and become a really successful politician. How much that's replicable internationally, that's a larger question.
It strikes me from what you described that cultural context matters, that national history matters in terms of how people approach this. And I keep thinking about how in American politics, for example, when people talk about charm and charisma, they usually do so with reference to figures like, say, Ronald Reagan, John F. Kennedy. There's always this sense of reaching back and identifying the last charming person that was in that office, or what best exemplifies that.
Absolutely. I do think history and culture matters in these cases. I also think that even in the German context, you see some charming and charismatic personalities, and even Merkel occasionally, as I said, played around with these tools. So it's always a complex question, but I think what is happening internationally throughout, more or less regardless of the context, is the power of personality, that we pay more attention to people, to individuals, than to institutions, policies, or other kind of traditional sides of politics. And, there are many reasons for that. One is the media environment that we are dealing with here. So as we pay more attention to individuals, the question is, how can a person embody complex, deep, important values? And is there an element of responsibility there to do so? But it is very hard to deny that contemporary politics is kind of mesmerized by personality, and these charming, magnetic personalities will rise and fall very quickly, like in theater, as you watch a performance. The question is what tools they will use and what purposes or what goals they will have in mind as they weaponize their personal magnetism. And it's also important to realize that there are professional teams behind them who will work on that. And it is really a fine line. I mean, as we all, many of us are on social media following political performances, we can all name, successful ones and really cringe ones, right? Where you feel like, oh, this should have been done, right? And that's so interesting. And even researching it for years now, it's very hard to decide, like, why is this AOC video, or why is that, whatever, Trump video, whichever political side you pick, is cringe, or in another case, simply it works. You fuse with the performance and you feel like, oh, he's just like me. He's authentic. I want to meet him.
We appreciate the time you've taken to speak with us, but before we go, could you tell us what you're working on now?
So I have two projects in mind. One is, they are very different, okay, so I do want to warn the listeners about that. One is about the question of why do kids love dinosaurs? And I would like to interview children and observe them playing with dinosaurs and going to museums and dino parks and so on, and trying to understand this key iconic figure in the time of climate change. So that's one of the projects. And the other that I'm thinking about considering is one about courage, that many of us, even in regular workplaces and meetings, are sometimes afraid to speak up. And I'm interested in this question of what are the moments when we have the courage to speak, and what are the moments when we feel like groupthink and the community we are part of is just not allowing that. And, if you are in academia, this is a big question of, diverse viewpoints and discussions and discourse, and how to shape academia in ways that is beneficial to students and society. So that's another project that I'm thinking on at the moment.
Well, those both sound like excellent projects. I wish you the best of luck with them.
Thanks so much, Mark.
Julia, thank you very much for taking some time out of your schedule to speak with us. I hope you have a wonderful day.
You too. Bye-bye.